For this tip, let's talk about how to create virtual Nashville tuning. In case you're not familiar with the concept, Nashville tuning is a popular sound for rhythm guitar parts and not just in country music. A few hit songs with Nashville tuning include Wild Horses by the Rolling Stones, Dust in the Wind from Kansas, Gimme Danger by Iggy Pop, Hey You, Pink Floyd, Wicked Game, Chris Isaak, and many others. It's not an alternate tuning in the standard sense because the strings are still tuned low to high, E, A, D, G, B, E. Instead, it adapts a 12-string set of strings, or string sets dedicated to Nashville tuning, to a conventional 6-string guitar. The first and second strings are the usual E and B respectively, but the lower 4 strings are tuned an octave higher than standard tuning. The downside to Nashville tuning is that you really need to dedicate a guitar to it. You'll have to adjust the intonation, maybe the truss rod too, and besides, you don't want to have to change strings all the time. Granted, after playing with Nashville tuning, you might want to dedicate a guitar to it, but in the meantime, we can create a similar effect with most DAWs. Although the sound isn't technically the same, it produces much of the same result. A bright, present rhythm sound, somewhat like a 12-string but less dense, that's mostly layered with a companion guitar part. Here's how you'd do it in Studio One. Copy your rhythm guitar track and select it. Then type F4 to bring up the inspector and set transpose to 12 so that the audio is an octave higher. Let's compare the transposed sound with the original guitar sound. That's pretty much all you need to do, but there are some ways you can optimize the sound. The audio quality of pitch stretching algorithms varies a lot. It's never perfect, although Studio One produces amazingly good octave above sound quality. Another issue is that with physical Nashville tuning, the first and second strings aren't transposed up an octave. This shouldn't really matter much because if you can hear the Nashville tuned guitar prominently, you're missing the point. It's to add texture. However, you might want to roll off the highs somewhat and give a little upper mid-range boost so that the sound sits a bit better in a mix. Also, note that it's traditional to layer the Nashville tuned guitar part with the same part played with a guitar that has standard tuning. Due to slight detunings between the two different guitars, you'll sometimes hear some shimmer, like with the 12-string guitar, or by adding a chorus unit. However, because the Nashville tuned track in Studio One is a copy of the original guitar track, the layering is perfect. If you don't want perfect layering, raise the inspector's tune control by about 10 or 15 cents to add some detuning. For some reason, I find tuning slightly sharp sounds better than tuning slightly flat. Yes, it really is that simple, and the bright sound can add a lot to a mix. Equalizers are some of the most important sound shapers in your toolkit. You probably have parametric EQ in your recording software, and possibly some other goodies like Pultec emulations or whatever, but there's another very useful equalizer that's hiding in plain sight. A focusing EQ that's like a graphic equalizer on steroids. The secret EQ is a multiband dynamics processor. When you think about it, a multiband dynamics processor is basically a graphic EQ with independent dynamics control for each band. But we can ignore the dynamics control aspect and use just the equalization. The reason why setting up this kind of EQ can be so fast is because most multiband dynamics processors offer the option to solo and mute individual bands and move the band's upper and lower limits around freely to focus precisely on the part of the spectrum you want to affect. The first step is to defeat the compression, so set the ratio for all bands in a multiband compressor to 1:1. Any attack, release, knee, and threshold controls don't matter because there's no compression. Now you can adjust the frequency ranges and levels for individual bands, and this is where being able to mute and solo bands is incredibly helpful. For example, suppose you want to zero in on the part of a vocal that adds intelligibility. With a parametric EQ, you would need to go back and forth between the frequency, bandwidth, and gain to find the sweet spot. With a multiband dynamics processor, just solo the upper mid-range band and move the crossover frequencies until you focus on the vocal frequencies with the most articulation. Then boost that band's gain. Simple. It's even better if your Multiband Dynamics processor has mix control, so you can blend the processed and unprocessed sounds to make the overall effect of the EQ more or less drastic. And speaking of drastic, the gain control in Studio One's Multiband Dynamics does plus and minus 36 dB, so you have more control over level than most parametric EQs. Being able to define individual bands, solo them, and adjust their gain and frequency ranges precisely can be a very useful technique that supplements the other EQs in your DAW. For general tone shaping, a Multiband Dynamics processor can be just the ticket when you need to dial in a sound as quickly and efficiently as possible. As the quest for expressive electronic instruments continues, many virtual instruments incorporate key switching to provide different articulations. A key switch doesn't play an actual note, but alters what you're playing in some manner. For example, let's look at Presence's Viola preset. It dedicates the lowest 5 white keys, outlined in red, to articulations like pizzicato, tremolo, and martelé. Or consider many of the libraries for native instruments Contact, which also dedicates lower notes to key switching. This is all great as long as you have a keyboard with enough keys. Articulations typically are on the lowest keys, so if you have a 49-key keyboard or even a 61-note keyboard and want to play over the full range, the only way to add articulations are as overdubs. Since the point of articulations is to allow for spontaneous expressiveness, this isn't the best solution. An 88-note keyboard is ideal, but it may not fit in your budget or fit physically in your studio. Fortunately, there's a convenient alternative, a mini keyboard like the Korg Nano Key 2 or Akai LPK25, which won't make too big a dent in your wallet. You don't need to care about the feel or action because really all you want is switches. Regarding setup, just make sure that both your main keyboard and the mini keyboard are set up under your DAW's external devices. This just works because the instrument will listen to whatever controllers are sending in data via USB. However, note that keyboard controllers with 5-pin DIN MIDI connectors require a way to merge the two outputs into a single data stream, or merging capabilities within the MIDI interface you're using. And of course, you'll need to drop the MIDI keyboard down a few octaves to reach the key switch range. But once you've done that, you're covered. I find it more convenient not to mix articulation notes in with the musical notes because if I cut, copy, or move a passage of notes, I may accidentally edit an articulation that wasn't supposed to be edited. Here's how to dedicate a separate track to key switching in Studio One. Call up the Add Track menu, specify the desired input, and give it a suitable name. So until you have that 88-note semi-weighted hammer action keyboard you've always dreamed about, now you have an easy way to take full advantage of key switching and enjoy a higher level of expressiveness and spontaneity. This tip is for those who won't sign off on a mix until they've heard it in a car. There may be a scientific reason why this is beneficial. Noise tends to mask sounds, so if one instrument you want to hear gets lost in the noise while another jumps out, try a mix that raises and lowers those levels, respectively. The ear doesn't discriminate level differences as accurately as pitch differences, so without noise masking a sound, the level may seem okay. But as soon as you mix in noise, an important sound may disappear. If you increase its level just a bit so you can hear it, when you remove the noise, there's a very good chance you'll like the new level setting better. Think of this as doing something similar to compression, but without applying any actual dynamics. You're just making sure that the levels that need parity reach the same general levels. Of course, this doesn't mean you want everything jumping out of the noise. Those tambourine and shaker parts are probably just fine as they are. The main sounds to listen to here are vocals, leads, drums, and bass, as well as their relationship to each other. This also doesn't mean you should mix consistently with noise because it will bias your hearing, and besides, it is truly annoying. I add noise in with a mix as a last diagnostic step. If the mix has sounded fine up until then and then passes this final test, I consider it ready to master. And I don't need to go driving anywhere either. There are many sources for noise, including downloads from the internet and the white noise source in synthesizers. Studio One has a built-in noise generator, so we'll take advantage of that. Create a stereo audio track and insert the tone generator plugin. Turn the track's fader all the way down so you don't get blasted by noise in the next steps. Choose pink noise as the waveform and click the on button to start generating noise. Finally, turn up the track's fader to add noise to the mix. One very cool aspect of the tone generator's noise is that it's true stereo, where the left and right channels don't correlate, so you don't get any center channel buildup, as would happen with a mono noise signal. As to how much noise to add, it's kind of like maximizing. Set at 6 dB below the mix's peaks, and you'll hear what occupies the upper 6 dB of dynamic range. Set at 12 dB below the mix's peaks, and you'll hear what's in the upper 12 dB of dynamic range. This isn't an exact spec per se, but it provides a rough standard of comparison. As crazy as this idea sounds, try it sometime and tweak your mix. Then turn off the noise, take a short break so your ears get acclimated back to normal hearing, and then check the mix again. I won't be surprised if you hear an improvement. In the days before click tracks, music had tempo changes. However, with good musicians, these weren't random. After analyzing dozens of songs, many, actually most of them, would speed up slightly toward the end of a chorus or verse, or during a solo, and then drop back down again. For example, many people feel James Brown had one of the tightest rhythm sections ever, which is true, but not because they were a metronome. There were premeditated, conscious tempo changes throughout the song, like speeding up during the run-up to the phrase, "Papa's got a brand new bag" in the song of the same name, then dropping back down again, only to speed up to the next climax. Furthermore, the entire song sped up linearly over the course of the song. Note that you didn't hear these kinds of changes as something obvious, you felt them. They added to the tension and release inherent in any music, which is a key element, along with dynamics, in eliciting an emotional response from listeners. When musicians played together in a room, it was easy to have natural tempo changes. These days, it's difficult for solo artists to plan out in advance when changes are going to happen. Also, if you use effects with tempo sync, not all of them follow tempo changes elegantly, and some can't follow tempo changes at all. Let's face it, it's a lot easier to record to a click track and have a constant tempo. However, there's an easy workaround. Add tempo changes to a finished mix, so you can complete your song and then add subtle tempo changes where appropriate. This also lets you compare a version without tempo changes and one with tempo changes. You may not hear a difference, but you'll feel it. Several DAWs can add tempo changes after the fact. With Studio One, for the highest possible fidelity, choose Options, Advanced, Audio, and check Use Cache for time-stretched audio files. Next, open a new song and bring in the mixed file. You need to embed a tempo, otherwise it's not possible to change the tempo, so open the inspector and enter a tempo under File Tempo. It doesn't have to match the original song tempo because we're making relative, not absolute changes. Also choose Time Stretch for tempo and Sound, Elastic Pro Formant, for the time stretch mode. Now let's modify the tempo track. Working with the tempo track is just like working with automation. Click and drag to create ramps and bend straight lines into curves if desired. You can set high and low tempo limits within the tempo track. The minimum difference between high and low tempo track values is 20 BPM. However, you can change the tempo track height to increase the resolution. The bottom line is that it's possible to create very detailed tempo changes quickly and easily. Here are two screenshots of tempo changes in songs. The first is a hard rock cover version of Walking on the Moon. The differences are fairly significant, starting with a low of 135 BPM, going up to 141 BPM, and dropping down as low as 134 BPM. Here's another example, a slower song called My Butterfly. It covers an even greater relative range because it goes from a low of 90 to a high of 96 BPM. Note that when possible, I maintain a constant tempo at the beginning and end.
It doesn't matter so much with songs, but with dance mixes I can add tempo changes in the track as long as there's a constant tempo on the intro and outro so DJs don't go crazy when they're trying to do beat matching. As to whether it's worth making these kinds of changes, all I know is that the songs I do with tempo changes get a better response than songs without tempo changes. Maybe it's coincidence, but I don't think so. If you want to hear a collection of songs where every one has tempo changes applied, go to youtube.com/The Craig Anderton and listen to the Singles album.
My lucky numbers 13 and 11. Looks like you're right because I'm floating on heaven.
I've presented this tip before, but it's such a useful one it bears repeating for those who weren't aware of it or who know about the tip but haven't actually tried it. Vocals are the most direct form of communication with your audience, so of course you want your vocal to be kind of a tractor beam that draws people in. Many engineers give a more intimate feel to vocals by using dynamics control like limiting or compression. While that has its uses, the downside is often telltale artifacts that sound unnatural. This technique of phrase-by-phrase gain edits can provide much of the intimacy and presence associated with compression, but with a natural, artifact-free sound. Furthermore, if you do want to compress the vocal further, you won't need to use very much dynamics control because the phrase-by-phrase gain edits will have done the majority of the work the compressor would have needed to do. The top track shows the original vocal. Now, let's split it into pieces to isolate sections of the vocals that have varying levels. You definitely want snap off for this. Depending on your DAW, it may be possible to do splits in the middle of words and not hear a click from the level change. This is because the DAW will add an automatic, very short crossfade to eliminate clicks. Note that Wave's Vocal Rider plugin can automate this process. However, taking the time to do it manually lets you really get into the details. For example, if you split just after an inhale, you can raise the level of a vocal section without raising the inhale's level. You can also do very precise level adjustments to maintain dynamics so that sections that are supposed to be soft remain soft. Change the levels so they're more consistent. Although you can make a rough adjustment visually, it's crucial to listen to the edited event in context with what comes before and after to make sure there aren't any issues with continuity. Sometimes soft parts are supposed to be soft. After you've done all the needed splits and edits, you'll want to bounce all the bits back together again. If you compare the processed version with the original track, it's clear that the vocal levels are much more consistent. That's all there is to it. If you want to hear this technique in action, you have been. All the narration in these tips has been processed with gain changes and then had a little limiting added to tame the very highest peaks. I also use this technique on all the vocals in the songs on my YouTube channel.
Biamping a guitar amp is useful for the same reasons that most studio monitors are biamped. Just as you can optimize speakers for high and low frequencies, you can optimize amps for high and low frequencies. For example, with heavily distorted chords, the high strings will be equally distorted and relatively indistinct. With biamping, the lower notes can have a big, beefy distortion sound, while the high notes ring out on top. First, let's record the guitar. Guitars are mono, but to play stereo games, we need to convert a mono track to dual mono. This allows using processors like the binaural pan and stereo reverbs. So, record a mono guitar track with channel mode set to mono. After recording, change channel mode to stereo and select what you recorded. Finally, choose Bounce Selection, Ctrl B. Now your guitar part is dual mono, meaning that the same part is in both the left and right channels, so it's recognized as stereo. Studio One can create FX chains that split the audio based on frequency. So in this case, frequencies below 924 Hz go to the left split, while frequencies above that go to the right split. Guitar Rig and the Wave Studio Rack can also split based on frequency. Next, it's time to choose the amps and set their parameters. The left split uses the MCM 800, a revered British amp that can marshal its resources to give big, beefy sounds. The right split's VC30 amp is known amongst the Vox Populi for its bright, ringing high end, so the two amps are ideal for delivering the desired result. Now, let's enhance the FX Chain's amp sound with some EQ, reverb, and stereo imaging to spread out the reverb a bit more. The EQ adds the equivalent of an amp's bright switch. With a non-biamped preset, you have to be very careful about adding brightness because it can emphasize any artifacts caused by intermodulation distortion. But that's not an issue here because of the VC30's clean high end. Meanwhile, the gentle low-frequency roll-off simulates more of an open-back cabinet sound. The reverb is sort of a cross between a spring and room sound, while the binaural pan spreads out the reverb signal for a wider stereo image. The pan setting is fairly conservative. Feel free to widen things further. This FX Chain makes an excellent template for further adventures with biamplification. The ability to create more focused distortion along with a convincing stereo image make biamplification a natural for getting the most out of amp sims. Thanks for watching. I hope these tips help you make better music. Enjoy GearFest 2020 online, and I'll see you next year.